beginnings and endings aren't that important because you're just tuning into a sound current. I was born in Colfax, California, which is in the Sierra Nevada mountains, in 1935, June 24th, 1935, to Irish father and an Italian mother. Before what people usually attribute to earliest memories, they say around 4 you'll have your earliest memory. But I distinctly remember having it in Colfax, where I was living up till the age of 4, hearing on the radio about the age of 3 a song called South of the Border Down Mexico Way. And that song made me cry. And I remembered it because it was such an emotional shock to my system when I heard this music. You know, I'd never had this experience before, being emotionally moved, you know, a 3-year-old kid. And that stayed with me kind of my life, my whole life, that this is what music can do to you, how deeply it can affect you. Maybe as deep as any experience we have in life. For a long time I didn't have an instrument, but when I'd go to somebody else's house where there was a piano, that's where I'd end up noodling around on the piano. Even, you know, as a small kid I didn't know what I was doing, but it fascinated me. I think I was in college before I finally made the decision that I would try to become a professional musician, probably as a teacher. I didn't have hopes for making it as a performer in the professional, especially as a pianist, because the bar is so high. But I knew that I wanted to be involved in music. I have a hard time with music categories. I mean, I'm called a minimalist, and what the hell does that mean, you know? That I only brush my teeth once a week, or, you know. So categories are hard, but I think that who's it? Duke Ellington, I think, said there's only 2 kinds of music, good and bad music. You know, I started out learning by ear, so most of the music I was playing when I was a really young kid, I just learned by ear from the radio, or I had an older cousin who played the piano, and I'd learn from him. Until I started really working on classical pieces, I didn't have any technique. I didn't have a proper approach to playing the piano. But I had 2 great piano teachers when I was young. One was Dwayne Hampton, who was a classically trained piano, and the other one was an Austrian pianist called Adolf Bahler, who was a quite famous concert pianist who unfortunately was captured by the Nazis, and they broke all the bones in his hands. But he still was an incredible piano player, and from Adolf Bahler I learned how to touch the piano, all the varieties of touch you can have, because even though he'd had this terrible thing happen to him, he had the most velvety touch on the piano. And how the whole approach of the weight of the arms and everything I learned from him. About 1959, I got a mono Wallenstock tape recorder, and I started making tape loops. I'd heard some experiments in European music using tape and using tape loops and using musique concrète. So when I heard those, I thought I really liked the way you could introduce so many sounds that weren't normally associated with music. And this was before actually I'd gotten to know John Cage or his music. I was studying the music of Stockhausen and Luigi Nono and other European composers and some American composers, and learning about composers who were kind of pushing the boundaries of music, acoustic music, and symphonic music. So and how to get new sounds out of instruments that were used the same way for centuries, you know. So I was doing all that at the same time I was making the tape loops. To me, I saw it all as just new kind of sounds that were starting to happen. People were finally really looking for ways to accept almost anything as music and as a way to work with music. Music is the involvement of the human spirit with sound. And once you get that, then you start getting psychological and emotional things that say sound of a streetcar going down, you know, or a train. They don't have that. You can associate emotions with those, but an intelligence behind it usually makes music. When I perform, I'm actually, because I do improvising, I'm composing on the spot in real time and thinking about the general form I'm in, how long it is, what's going to happen. It's kind of all laying out before me. I haven't experienced it yet, but I know what I'm going towards. Composing for other people involves taking yourself out of a real time flow, which you have when you're improvising. So I have time to stop and consider, do I want it this way, or do I want it that way, or do I want to, you know, what the general form is trying to express. I don't plan things when I compose like an architect drawing the whole thing out first and then filling in the dots. I kind of build like a guy who's a sculptor who's putting on a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and then see where it's going to go, and then, oh, this needs to be added here, this needs to come down there. So I kind of work in a plastic way, you know, like actually a pragmatic way. What was there that was not? 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 If you know what you're doing in the arts, then you're doing it wrong. That's a pretty good maxim. If you don't know what you're doing, then you're on the right track because you're open to the whole world of possibilities. You don't want to already have the possibilities in you. You want them to be. You want to invite them in. So as an artist, you kind of have to create a culture that invites ideas in. And so how could you know what you're going to be doing? So I generally begin by just something attracts me, some kind of hook, some kind of melody, a rhythmic idea, gets me started, and then, you know, adding on to that, changing that, and maybe at some point throwing that whole thing away because it's already brought in material that I like better. So it's a step-by-step process. You don't always know from the beginning what you're going to do, whether you're going to be continuing on with the first idea you've gotten. So I have often abandoned pieces, you know, after working on them for a long time just because they don't represent this kind of the level of music that I really want to be engaged with. I thought that we could make them work, but I couldn't. So there's a certain point with a composition where you know, yeah, I like this, I'm being moved by this, I don't care what else happens, I like this. So you make that decision that, you know, and the other question is, when is it over, you know? So for me, music is a continuum, and beginnings and endings aren't that important because you're just tuning into a sound current that's there already, and you're letting people get on the train at a certain stop, letting them off at a certain place. But there's no final ending like Beethoven where you have a big cadence, you know. I don't do that. Well, I went to Europe in 1962 to live for a couple of years, and I've just been out of the university, and I really was tired of academia, but I still wanted to write music and be involved in music. At the end of my stay in Europe, I met Chet Baker and worked with him and started looping his trumpet playing and his groups playing. And we did a performance of a piece called The Gift at the Theater of Nations in 1963 in Paris. And that kind of was a turning point for me because I saw how Chet was playing these fragments, and they could kind of, when they were combined together, make a kind of chamber music. So I didn't know what to do with that. I came back to California and started trying to write ideas out that would incorporate this new, what I considered a new kind of process of composing. But I wasn't successful to really get what I wanted. And then one night I was playing ragtime piano in San Francisco, and I was writing to work on in the bus. And I was a bit altered and really feeling good on the bus. And suddenly, NC was like an epiphany. I heard it like bells ringing out of heaven. It was like I heard the music of NC on the bus. So I played my shift and went home and wrote down what I could remember of it and you know, kind of fleshed out the rest of it. But it was all done in one night. It's a kind of piece that hasn't happened to me ever before like that. It's like a gift. Here, you know, I'll play this for you. You can write it down and be considered the composer. But I don't feel I composed it. I heard it. It was being played for me. I mean, I remember Handel talking about the Messiah like that, and I want to compare NC to the Messiah, but it was a similar process of listening to the piece unfold, not trying to be a schemer, you know, and make it happen. It was just being played to me. I started getting interested in Indian music in the mid to late 60s. You know, in terms of a listener, and I went to a few concerts, and I was really impressed with the level of performance that Indian musicians exhibited, such a high level of virtuosity, and that done with an improvisatory way. It wasn't like they were playing from a score that was complicated. They were actually doing this all from memory, and it really attracted me was that there was so much joy in their music. They had so much fun playing their music because they had all this stuff internalized, and they could call it up anytime they wanted. And I hadn't seen that except a little bit in jazz in the Western world. But Indian music is much older than jazz, so it's much more involved, much more developed. But I never thought about studying it until 1970, and I met Pandit Pranath, and he asked me to become his disciple. And I was so mesmerized by his music that I accepted and went to India with him. I had really a lot of connections in Europe at that time for my own music, so I wrote to everybody that I'd been playing with, and there's a lot of people in Scandinavia, and especially Sweden, where I was pretty well connected. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway. I wrote to all these people and told them that I had been studying with this great master in India, and I would like to bring him on tour. So it all came together, and we left India and went on tour Scandinavia. Then we all came back to America, and I think my world before Indian classical music was searching for a kind of tradition in music that I didn't know about. And when I found Indian classical music, it had so many answers for me about things I was trying to solve in my own music. How do you use modal music in a form, for instance? That's a big question for Western musicians, because we had a big modal music tradition, in the 14th century and 13th century, and then harmony took over, and then musicians really didn't know how to work with modal harmony and how to create a form with it, I feel. So they kind of abandoned it and went just for harmonic structure. So India has always been modal music, no harmony. And so the whole vocabulary in Indian classical music has to do with modes. And modes kind of translate also to psychological moods. So they have it all categorized how you want to feel. You play that raga that makes you feel that way. When you work continuously on a tradition that's 1,200 years old, a lot of information builds up and a lot of complexity builds up, and especially an oral tradition where you have to memorize everything. But Indian music was always an oral tradition, always taught from master to disciple, and on like that, over hundreds of years. Well, a lot of people don't know that I've written a lot of orchestral music. They know me as, most of people experience my music from my own recordings, solo and performances with small groups that I've organized and played with. But I've also written, since 1980, which is 42 years, I've worked really closely with the Kronos Quartet, and I've written almost 30 works for them. That's been my major writing kind of, my major catalog in writing has been for Kronos. But I've written for a lot of saxophone quartets, all kinds of small ensembles, and then a series of orchestral works. I haven't written an opera, except I had an improvised opera that like an opera, was a theater piece based on the work of Adolf Wöffli, who is a Swiss artist.
Adolf Wöffli, The Litany of Positive Identities. Naturalist.
Naturforscher.
Poet.
Dichter.
Writer.
Schreiber.
Draftsman.
Zeichner.
Composer.
So Adolf Wöffli he was born in the 19th century, into the 19th century, lived into the early part of the 20th century, maybe died around 1930, I think. He was, a laborer. He was the son of a prostitute who died early, had a terrible childhood, poverty. He was arrested for child molesting and sentenced to prison. But then he ended up, instead of prison, he was sent to the Waldau Mental Institution in Bern, Switzerland. And so for about 30 or 40 years, he lived in this one cell in the Waldau Clinic. And he was a violent person. If they let him out of his room, he'd beat up the other inmates. But they found out that if they gave him paper and pencil, he would draw endlessly and ceaselessly, 16 hours a day until pencils wore out. And then he'd scream for more pencils. And his body of work, which I discovered in the late 80s, or mid-80s in Bern, Switzerland. I went to one of his shows, and I was so devastated by his work. I'd never run into an artist whose work spoke to me so deeply. And I decided I wanted to collaborate with his work some way. And I became obsessed again with Wolfley. I was reading I got all the catalogs, all the books about him, all of his, and he wasn't only an artist, but he was a poet and wrote amazingly clever poetry, really real funny. It was, makes you laugh. But it's also deep and metaphysical. And his drawings were kind of, really have influenced my drawing a lot because they're kind of like the music and the subject matter of the drawing all intertwine in a certain, and poetry, and also his biography he put in his drawings. So he was writing his biography, musical examples, drawings of its surroundings that he remembered when he was out of the mental institution. He'd draw, barren towns, barren buildings. And stuff. So Wolfley's approach to music, I consider him one of my major gurus in life, even though, I never met him. He died before I was born. But I felt he was a teacher for me. And so I wrote this chamber opera called the St. Adolph Ring. He called himself St. Adolph. He was totally mad, but divinely inspired. And this, to me, it seemed like fertile ground for a musical. So I formed a small kind of company with my good friend John Dedrick, who's an actor, and Mikhail Graham, who's a sound technician that I worked with for years, and Sally Davis, who was a dancer and singer. And we created, kind of together, we created this opera. I created all the music. Sally created a lot of choreography and the artwork. And John wrote a libretto for the opera.
Many of the most manifold giant factories in the mentioned district employ year in, year out the enormous number of 15,000 to 30,000 workers in the most manifold trades and professions, each with the appropriate.
So we performed it several times. The last time it was performed was in Bern, Switzerland at the Bern Museum, 3 nights. And after that, the agent that was helping me book it, I left her, and we never did have subsequent performances. But it was all improvised. There was no score. Everything was in everybody's heads, and we could change the lines around every night. And I wrote a lot of songs for it. That kind of stayed. The lyrics to the songs kind of stayed the same.
Candidate for the loony bin. Forced identity. Delinquent by misfortune. Bitter catastrophe. Monster.
It was, it was fun to do because it was so spontaneous, and anybody would take off during the opera in any way they wanted. So that's my opera. I came to Japan in 2020 as part of a world tour. So I was invited by the Galaxy Art Festival to come and research a project for Sado Island, both a concert and to design a music monument to leave on the island. No. So here was this was kind of like one of the early ideas, but which I really liked, was a hand coming out of the clouds and the chimes were hanging down. But there was no way to build it. It had to hang from a skyhook or something. Right? It's an anti-gravity machine. But this is the tuning for the Okarimasen melody. So that was, I hope the other ones are in here too. Huh? This is autogeographical tails drawings. So then, realizing I couldn't hang it, but I still wanted to have hands involved. We made them these, what you saw the photographs of it. The chimes had to be manufactured on Sado. Here's another. This is kind of this was before too. This was like an earlier one. No, this is the latest one because we were going to put it on a base to make it taller. Like all projects, we were a little bit limited by the budget because I wanted these arms to be taller, but it costs so much more money to make them taller. So, at some point we had to just decide in order to make it. Here's the first sketch I made. Oh no, maybe this is Sarasan's. But it was a nice drawing and it helped me draw this one. I've been doing a lot of writing. I started writing when I first got to Kobichizawa. I started writing for the Galaxy Festival show. I didn't know who we were going to have as musicians, so I had to kind of write these generic charts that anybody could play. So I was working on writing. Sarah and I have a duo called Everything and Beyond. So we both live in the same building and could get together and work on the music for the duo. Da di da di da di Raga Pichakari da di da di da di Raga Pichakari. I'd definitely like to keep performing as long as I'm able because to me that is where a lot of ideas are created. The fire of the stage always brings new material, because the intensity of the way you have to be when you're improvising on stage invites new things in because you're taking chances and you're trying to go for things, right? So I think performance is a good way for me to keep in shape, kind of like a boxer, if you don't fight and you only go out once in a while, you're going to get knocked out, because you're not being tested.